In the lovely city of Greystone, there was a highly respected school named Elizabeth's College, famous for its excellence and perfection. The school was well known for its talented students and the many awards they won. Whenever Elizabeth's College participated in competitions, they always came in first place without fail. Because of this reputation, every parent in Greystone wanted their children to study at Elizabeth's College, hoping they would become among the best. However, what no one knew was that behind the school's perfect image, something strange was happening behind the scenes. In one of the classes at Elizabeth's College, there was a very strict teacher named Mrs. Haberbat, but the students called her Mrs. Tafari because of her tough nature. Mrs. Tafari was famous for her sharp words and harsh looks. She controlled her classroom like a strict army commander, making everyone fear her. Although she was very smart and skilled, her personality made her seem like a monster to the students. Just hearing her name would scare them, and whenever she walked by, the students would go silent, as if something powerful had passed. Mrs. Tafari's classroom was clearly divided. She arranged the students in a way that the quick learners and top performers sat in the front row, while the students who struggled were placed at the back. She treated the front row students, whom she called the stars, with kindness and care because they were bright and did well in every subject. They were always the first to answer questions and rarely made mistakes. However, she treated the back row students, whom she called the shadows, very poorly. These students found it hard to keep up and often asked questions because they didn't understand the lessons easily. Mrs. Tafari had no patience for the shadows and was often cruel to them. Whenever these students made a mistake, stumbled over their words, or couldn't solve a math problem, she would punish them harshly in front of the whole class or shout at them loudly. "You useless child! Do you even have a brain, or is it just empty? You're so foolish," she would yell, embarrassing them in front of everyone. Because of this, the top students started to make fun of the struggling ones, thinking they were better. They avoided the shadows and acted as if they were superior, all because Mrs. Tafari praised them and put down the others. One of the students sitting at the back with the shadows was Onye. She was a gentle and quiet girl. Her parents were always busy with work and had little time for her. Onye loved drawing and writing stories, so her mind often drifted during lessons. She also found math and numbers very challenging. Mrs. Tafari saw Onye's struggles as laziness and often made fun of her in front of the class more than others. One day, when Onye couldn't solve a math problem on the board, Mrs. Tafari said, "Onye, maybe you should go back to being a baby. I don't think you belong here. You're too slow and dull." The whole class laughed as Onye walked back to her seat, tears in her eyes. The next day, after Onye's parents got ready for work, Onye told them she didn't want to go to school. Her parents were shocked. "Are you sick?" her mother asked, but Onye said no. Instead of asking why she didn't want to go, they assumed she was being stubborn. Her mother shouted, "I see what's happening. You just want to stay home and watch movies while your classmates are learning, right?" Her father added, "You're lucky I'm late for my flight, or I would have knocked some sense into you." They forced her into the car, dropped her off at school, and gave her some money for snacks. Onye felt helpless and hurt. She didn't know who to talk to about what she was going through. As days passed, the classroom became more tense. The stars enjoyed Mrs. Tafari's praise, while the shadows became quieter and performed worse because they were afraid of her. Whenever Mrs. Tafari had to choose a student for a competition, she always picked one of the stars and ignored the shadows completely. No one outside the class knew what was happening, and the students were too scared to report Mrs. Tafari to the school authorities. They feared she would punish them even more. So, Onye and the other shadows continued to suffer in silence. One day, a new student named Musa joined Elizabeth's College and was placed in Mrs. Tafari's class. Musa was taller than most kids his age and had a unique confidence that stood out. Mrs. Tafari assumed he wasn't smart because of his height and placed him with the shadows at the back. Musa quickly noticed how unfair the classroom was. He saw how Mrs. Tafari mocked and belittled the students at the back and how the other students looked down on them. Musa decided he had to do something to change this. During an English lesson one day, Mrs. Tafari asked the stars to read a passage. They read it perfectly, and everyone clapped. Then she called OEI to read the same passage. As usual, OEI struggled with some words and read slowly. Mrs. Tafari began to humiliate her, yelling, "Senseless girl! Is this how your classmates read? Will you ever learn?" Just then, Musa raised his hand from the back of the class. Everyone was shocked because no shadow had ever done that before. Musa confidently asked if he could read the passage instead. Mrs. Tafari, thinking he would embarrass himself, allowed him to try. To everyone's surprise, Musa read the passage perfectly, showing that even the shadows could shine if given a chance. Mrs. Tafari looked at Musa with surprise, but then she smiled, thinking he would fail. "Yes, Musa, how can I help you?" she asked. Musa confidently replied, "May I read the passage instead, ma'am?" Mrs. Tafari agreed, saying, "Of course, come and embarrass yourself like your fellow shadow." The class laughed as Musa walked to the front to take the book. Everyone expected him to fail, but to their shock, Musa read the passage perfectly in a clear and confident voice. When he finished, the class fell silent. Musa then handed the book to OEI and said kindly, "Your turn." OEI was scared and didn't want to be humiliated again, but Musa encouraged her to trust him. OEI took the book, and Musa stood beside her as she began to read. Whenever she made a mistake, Musa corrected her gently and patiently. At first, her voice shook, but with Musa's help, she grew more confident. By the time she finished, the class was silent again. Then, one by one, the students at the back started clapping for OEI. It was the first time a shadow had impressed the class. Mrs. Tafari was speechless, and Musa and OEI returned to their seats with smiles on their faces. After that day, the students at the back of the class grew closer to Musa. He began teaching them how to read and solve math problems. It was clear they wanted to learn, but Mrs. Tafari never gave them a chance. Musa took it upon himself to help them during breaks and after school. He was patient and kind, and slowly, the shadows started to improve. However, Mrs. Tafari continued to humiliate them whenever they struggled in front of the class. Musa was deeply troubled by Mrs. Tafari's behavior and knew he had to do something. One day, during a math lesson, Mrs. Tafari taught a new topic and called on the stars to answer questions. They all answered correctly. Then she called on the students at the back. Some of them answered well because Musa had already taught them the topic. But when OEI was called, she couldn't answer. Mrs. Tafari became furious and started hitting OEI with her cane, ignoring her cries. She didn't realize the principal was walking nearby. Hearing OEI's screams, the principal rushed to the classroom. By the time he arrived, OEI had fainted. Her head was bleeding, and she lay on the floor in a pool of blood. Mrs. Tafari stood nearby, still holding the cane stained with OEI's blood. The principal was shocked and immediately called the school ambulance. OEI was taken to the hospital, and Mrs. Tafari was arrested and placed in detention. The news of Mrs. Tafari's situation spread quickly through the school. Most students, especially those from the back row of her class, were relieved and happy. However, Musa was not. He cared about OEI and her kind nature, so he was deeply saddened by her injury. Thankfully, OEI received treatment at the hospital, and her head wound was stitched. When Onye's parents found out about their daughter's condition, they immediately left their busy schedules. Her mother rushed to the hospital, while her father booked the next flight to be by her side. Seeing her parents worried and beside her, Onye felt hurt. She said, "I tried to tell you why I didn't want to go to school anymore, but you didn't listen. Maybe if I had died, you would have understood." Her parents felt ashamed and begged Onye to forgive them for prioritizing their work over her well-being. Meanwhile, Mrs. Tefari sat in the detention center, filled with regret. She prayed silently, hoping Onye would recover. Every time a staff member walked by, she would anxiously ask, "How is Onye? Is she okay?" But no one answered her. They ignored her, which only made her more afraid and guilty. A few days later, after Onye was discharged from the hospital, she visited Mrs. Tefari at the detention center with the principal, Musa, and her parents. When Mrs. Tefari saw them, she broke down in tears. Seeing the bandage on Onye's head, she fell to her knees and begged for forgiveness. Onye smiled and asked her to sit down. The principal said, "Elizabeth's college is meant to nurture students, not break them. Your harshness created an environment of fear, making it hard for students to learn." Mrs. Tefari reflected on her actions and cried as she apologized. She explained, "When I was young, I wasn't smart or promising. My teacher ridiculed me and made others avoid me because I was a slow learner. She believed I'd never succeed. To prove her wrong, I worked hard and eventually became top of my class. When I became a teacher, I carried that anger and treated my students the same way, thinking it would push them to improve. I was wrong. Please forgive me." The principal and Onye's parents understood her pain and showed her compassion. With Onye's approval, they released Mrs. Tefari but gave her a 2-week suspension. During her absence, the classroom changed. The stars began to admire Musa's bravery and started helping their classmates instead of mocking them. Onye grew more confident with their support, and the classroom became a place of learning and kindness once again. When Mrs. Tefari returned after her suspension, she was a changed person. Though it wasn't easy, with Musa's influence and therapy, she became more caring and fair to all her students. Onye's parents also changed. They started listening to her and made time to support her studies. They even hired a private tutor to help her during holidays. By the end of the year, Onye had improved greatly, and many other students did too. The classroom was no longer divided, and everyone worked together to succeed. Mrs. Tefari finally admitted her mistakes and thanked Musa for reminding her of an important truth: every student has potential, and it's a teacher's role to help them discover it. Years later, Onye became a famous author. In her book, she wrote on the first page, "Dedicated to the boy who believed in me and the teacher who learned to change." By then, Mrs. Tefari had retired. As she read Onye's book, she felt a mix of pride and regret, grateful that Onye had proven her wrong by achieving greatness. This story teaches us that kindness has the power to transform lives. Being patient and encouraging can bring out the best in others, while harshness only pushes them down. A little support can unlock hidden talents. Every person has value, and everyone learns at their own pace. By recognizing and nurturing individual strengths, we create a more positive and productive environment. True leaders can come from anywhere, just like Musa, who, despite being labeled a shadow, showed courage and empathy that changed the classroom for the better. It's never too late to change. Mrs. Tefari's story shows that even deeply rooted behaviors can be unlearned. Reflecting on our actions and striving to improve can lead to growth and redemption. Unity is powerful. When people work together and support one another, they achieve more than they could alone. The students in the story broke down barriers by helping each other, proving that collaboration builds stronger communities. Finally, learning is a two-way process. Teachers can learn from their students just as much as students learn from their teachers. Staying open to feedback and growth is crucial for anyone in a position of influence. This story reminds us that with kindness, patience, and unity, we can create a world where everyone has the chance to shine. Subscribe to African Tales by Zoe for amazing stories full of culture and wisdom. Don't miss out, hit subscribe and join us.